Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the Kupyansk direction where we see that the Russian forces have managed to advance in the direction of Avdiivka. Last month we saw that the Ukrainian forces managed to counterattack and push back the progress the Russian forces has made in this direction. Now the Russian forces are reattempting their offensive operations in the direction of the village, managing to advance in the direction from the northern area as well as capturing the forest line here in the northeast of the village, and they will likely threaten the supply route to Avdiivka on the eastern side again, while the western side remains unfazed as the Ukrainian forces have the cover of the forest line here to the northwest, defending their supply lines there from direct fire from the Russian forces. We then move on to the Bakhmut direction where we here see that the Russian forces managed to push the Ukrainian forces back and contest the village of Khomove, with additional information being released this morning suggesting that the Russian forces managed to actually capture the full village. However, I've yet to receive confirmation from Syriac Maps, which is my primary source for the map changes, as he has proven through the whole conflict and previous conflicts that he is a reliable source and his methodology is the best out there for this conflict. The village of Khomove is a difficult one for the Ukrainians to hold, and if the Russian forces manage to gain full control over it, which they reportedly have, then they would be able to start pushing westwards. It is unlikely that they will. However, with this they will have negated all of the Ukrainian gains in their counteroffensive, and we will likely see the Russian forces pushing towards Avdiivka, which it did at the end of the capture of Bakhmut last spring. While rendering the video, it was reported and confirmed by Syriac Maps that the Russian forces managed to capture Khomove, and with this the Russian forces are now closing in on having full control over the northern flank of Bakhmut, and with this the only locations the Ukrainians have are fortifications by the Road of Death, as well as the area here to the north of Khomove and Avdiivka. All of these allow the Ukrainian forces to still threaten Russian positions here in the northern flank of Bakhmut, because the Russian positions are by Yahidna and Avdiivka. With this, they are at the very core of the northern flank. So unless the Russian forces capture Avdiivka, then the Ukrainian forces can at any time launch a counterattack here in the northern parts of the city. We then move on to the Avdiivka area, where here in the southern parts the Russian forces managed to advance further in the direction of Severne, where they here have locations at the outskirts of the forest lines to the southeast of the village, and with this they have a direct view over the village from the southern direction, as we see here. The Russian tactic in the Avdiivka area is to attack one by one. They started in northern parts, they then went to the southeastern parts, and now we may see an assault towards Severne. In connection with my analysis, I just got a VR headset, and through that I started using Google Earth Maps on VR, and from that I took these pictures. The first one shows the Russian perspective from their positions here by the forest lines to the southeast of Severne towards the village here located in the north. So with this we see here, it is more difficult to see than in VR, but there is right here, this is a high ground. The locations, the fields here to the north are slightly below a couple meters, and with that the Russian forces in the forest lines will have a clear view towards the village of Severne. As we see on the map, we see that the Russian forces here in this location have nothing between their location, their positions, and the village except for the field. And from this slightly elevated position, they're able to clearly directly see and directly fire into the village of Severne. And with that, the Ukrainian forces would have a difficulty holding their positions here, as it would be in a direct confrontation with the Russian forces in the south. We then move on to the southeastern parts of Avdiivka, where we have some perspectives from the industrial zone. This first picture is from the residential zone here to the southwest of the industrial zone, and from it we can see multiple things. First off, there is this rift between the residential zone here to the southwest and the residential zone on the other side. This is why it's difficult to pass in between the two directions, and with the trenches all over the front, which we also see here, we can see that the Ukrainian positions here are safe from the Russian positions so far. However, it does seem that the Russian positions are slightly more elevated than the Ukrainian ones, which could threaten their positions with direct fire from here. We also see that the quarry area here is at a lower elevation, and therefore the Russian forces could just overlook the whole area. No Ukrainian positions would be there, but on the other side, and as such we see that they'll likely be in the forest areas. Taking a look at the map, we can see how the Ukrainian positions are likely located here in the forest areas and in the residential area on the other side of the quarry. As such, the quarry is in the gray zone as I have mapped out. So with that, we see that the Ukrainian forces here in the trench network to the south of Avdiivka are likely going to hold on to their positions despite the Russian capture here to the north of their location. So we'll likely see that the Russian forces will continue more westwards towards the residential area rather than southwards towards the fortified position of the Ukrainian forces. If they manage to cut off their supply lines, then the Ukrainian forces will be forced to retreat from this area despite the heavy fortifications here, as without supplies you cannot defend. We have this next picture, which is the forest area slightly northeast of the industrial zone. From the location right here at the outskirts in the northern parts, we see that this whole forest area here is located on the high grounds overseeing the city of Avdiivka. With the outskirts of the forest areas here by the horizon, we see that these whole areas are all located on the low ground. So this elevation here is overlooking the whole city, but then we see the further you go in, the higher the elevation goes, and this area right here is located somewhat in a valley in between the two sides. We can see the elevation difference here. So with this, we see that the Russian forces, if they manage to gain control over the forest area, to the southeast of the city, they would overlook most of the city of Avdiivka, and all of this whole area here between the forest areas and the city proper area that are located on a higher ground would be vulnerable to the Russian forces here in the area. So the forest area is going to be the next target of the Russian forces here to the southeast. They'll likely focus on that rather than the city itself, as getting control over the forest area will give them a huge advantage here in the south. We then take a look to the northern parts by the waste heap here in the north of the city. From this perspective, we can clearly see how the waste heap is giving a huge advantage when it comes to the elevation towards the whole city area of Avdiivka. We can see here the coke plant area is all of it at a lower elevation than the waste heap, and the waste heap gives a clear overview over the whole area. With the Russian control over the waste heap, they can clearly get proper reconnaissance positions, allowing them to see any Ukrainian troop movement directly from the positions, as well as allowing them to have direct fire positions in the heights here in the area, allowing them to attack Ukrainian positions from across the railways. We then take a look at the water treatment plant here to the south of the waste heap. From this perspective, we can see that with the control over the water treatment plant here, the Russian forces also have the height elevation advantage towards the whole Dacha area. With the river line in between, there's no direct confrontation between the Russian and Ukrainian forces here. However, the Russian forces from this other direction have managed to enter and take control over the outskirts of the Dacha area. And with the support of Russian soldiers from across the river line, they are able to have a clear overview over the whole Dacha area. And then we'll also likely see the Dacha area here to the north of the city of Avdiivka, facing fights from and between the Russian and Ukrainian forces, with them having the high grounds here in the area. And from a slightly different perspective, we also see this picture here, which is also from the water treatment plant here. We can see the coke plant and the Russian forces having control over the outskirts of the forest lines here. To the east of the Avdiivka coke plant, we see that the Russian forces nearing almost the outskirts of the forest line, with it being in the gray zone, and the Russian forces control over the water treatment plant will not be able to storm Avdiivka coke plants directly from the east. And with that, we also hear reports that the Russian forces have started their initial attacks towards the coke plant, with an overview from the waste heap and the water treatment plant areas, as well as direct access to the Avdiivka coke plant from the roads here to the north and to the east of it. And with the Russian forces having visual control over the Dacha area and the control over the northern outskirts of it, the Ukrainian forces would have a difficulty launching a counterattack, as any concentration of forces will be directly noticed by the Russian forces, whether they have drones in the air or not. And with that, we see that the Russian forces are slowly moving to get better positions here in the northern parts before actually storming the Avdiivka coke plant completely. However, with the counterattack of the Ukrainian forces from Khomove, it allows them to get a better position here in the north, and makes it more difficult for the Russian forces to storm the Avdiivka coke plant, because the Ukrainian forces would likewise have good overview over the situation from that position. So that's going to be it for this update. Let me know what you think of the satellite imagery and how it adds to the analysis of the situation. And thank you all for watching, and have a great day.